games with numbers in the title. I'm jumping around here a little bit. Resident Evil 7, Resident Evil, Biohazard with a 7 for the Z.
Heavy 7.
Yeah. You guys both got a chance to play this. There's a preview event back in, what, December?
Yes.
Last year?
Yes.
December 2016?
Back in the day.
Correct.
What's up with Resident Evil?
So, based on all the trailers, even the stuff we saw at PSX, I was like, what the hell is this game? It looks kind of like Outlast. It doesn't look like what I know of Resident Evil at all. And I wasn't sold on that. I didn't necessarily think it was a bad thing, but it didn't look like Resident Evil to me. It didn't look like what I wanted it to be. It's totally Resident Evil. So I played 4 hours at an event, and, you know, it has all of the stuff that I love Resident Evil for, like weird, obscure items that work with doors that you hadn't seen when you got the item, and you have no idea how they interact with each other.
You've got to use the Tiffany lamp to open the sliding glass door.
Pretty much. It's actually on my
The
embargo
tiger's
sheet.
glass eye opens the bathroom.
I'm literally not allowed to talk about all the weird keys and stuff that's
really?
under embargo. Yeah, they've just done such a good job of really trying to lock this game down so that nothing is
get it.
spoiled. And there's also like really overpowered weapons, but you still feel helpless, which is something that's really staple Resident Evil to me. You know, you get a pistol and you shoot something in the head 5 times and it doesn't die, and you have to like deal with that ammo conservation. There's still also the item chest, so you have to really manage your inventory. It just chainsaws and shotguns, and none of it makes you feel powerful. So I feel like it's really back to what Resident Evil originally felt like. It is first person, and obviously that's a huge change. I think it works. It's a little bit scarier, I guess. There are
Can you
some-
see your feet?
I didn't check.
God, I can't
Regret.
I was gonna check.
Yeah,
It's also got VR support, right? And
Yeah.
it's
it
like,
does. And
This is probably one of the biggest PSVR. It's probably the biggest PSVR.
yeah. That's
yeah,
kind of
the longest as well.
Definitely in terms of like hours that of the game that you can play in VR. Like it's
Yeah.
not like a Tomb Raider add-on throwaway thing.
Yep.
This is like you can theoretically play the whole game. The impression I got from talking to Capcom folks is like they don't really expect that to be the primary way most people interact with the game.
I would rather die.
Really?
Oh man, it's, you know, even playing it normally, so you're not being chased constantly, but there is a character who is following you kind of through this giant house that just keeps getting bigger and bigger as you go on sometimes. And every time that I would see him or hear him nearby, I would just hide in a corner in the shadows and wait for him to go somewhere else in the house, which is particularly cool because I don't think he was on a loop.
Yeah.
I think that he just walks kind of spontaneously, so you don't really know where he is, which
The
is really
sound
cool.
design is so good on
It
that
is
stuff
really
too.
good.
Like when you hear him, like you hear a door open like 2 rooms away and he's
Yeah.
coming up on you, it's
You
like
can hear
hell
him.
the
Yeah,
worst.
But he's easy enough to avoid, which is another thing I like, is that when he's kind of following you in a certain part of the game,
what's he like?
I don't even know where to start on
Is
that.
it a man?
It's a man.
He's a dad.
He's a dad?
Yeah.
He's a dad like
He's in the
spooky dad.
trailers that we've seen.
Okay.
He's a big old hillbilly.
he cusses at you sometimes.
He does.
Really?
Yeah. Oh, he's called me a really bad word that I don't want to make anyone have to spend time bleeping, but it was a combination of swear words that was very creative.
Wow.
He's a very big angry man who, you know, I'm not going to spoil anything, but
Right.
he is in the trailers. We have seen him. He's part of the Baker family.
From like a combination of what I've seen and what I've heard from people who played it sort of behind the scenes, it seems like they're taking a lot of cues from like classic old school horror in the way that like specific segments are like, oh, that's a nod to Psycho, that's a nod to Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Yeah.
Like the family specifically that they're using in a lot of the key art is totally that scene in Texas Chainsaw Massacre where they all have like weird dinner with that rubber grandpa man.
Totally. And it seems like the way that they're dealing with the family is, it feels like, I don't know this because I didn't get that far, but it seems like they're all kind of tied to certain parts of this ridiculously huge house. So there's like one part is the dad, one part will be the mother, and they all kind of have like different elements sort of, and they're all spaced out. And you just have to like unlock one part to get to the next part of the house. And I think you're looking for someone is why you're there, but there's a huge amount of lore. And I don't know yet if it ties into the previous Resident Evil games, but it definitely has sci-fi elements.
Yeah.
100%.
I totally agree with you that like it is so surprising how much of a real Resident Evil game this is, because at a glance you could totally mistake it for being like a weird departure.
Such a weird choice in the marketing.
Once you get into it, it's like, oh, this is like I had a moment in the game that really stood out to me where like there was a bunch of enemies in this room, and in between they were in between me and the place I needed to get, and I had the choice to either craft health with the limited items I had or craft like 10 pistol shots, and I crafted 10 pistol shots and like fought all the enemies, which you could have run past, I guess, theoretically.
That's what I did.
Yeah.
I ran.
Well, what happened was like I killed them all, but at the end of that sequence, I had 1 shot left in my gun, and I was like, that is so cool and doesn't happen in video
And I
games
think
anymore.
like just after that part, there's like a boss fight. And
Yeah.
Yeah, it's tough. And it totally does feel like Resident Evil 1 and 2, I think more than 4. Also, in terms of scale, it's probably more like 1. But I mean, I loved it, and when I finished playing it, I came back here and spoke to so many people about it, and I'm so excited about it. Like, I hated that I had to stop playing it. It's really good.
I really can't wait for this. I think, Nick, what you just said is really interesting too, about sort of ammo conservation, how games aren't made like that anymore.
Yeah.
Most people nowadays, I think, especially first-person games, you're used to just like kind of standing there and rejuvenating and just coming back to life and being okay, or like hiding behind a wall and being like everything's safe, or picking up a billion more pistols. So this is kind of awesome. I hope it kind of like kicks a bunch of kids' ass.
I mean, it even has those rooms that you go in and save in. There's like a little cassette tape, and
do they make
has
that
the
weird spooky music?
Yeah, like it's totally the same as it used to be.
Does it still work weird where like if you put like a sandwich in one of them in one part of the house, like it appears in the other?
Yes.
That made
I think
really?
Because you have a big
Yes.
item storage box, right?
Yes.
And every one of those you go to has all your stuff in it. So you can't teleport sandwiches if you find sandwiches.
Teleport.
Is it weird that like I was hung up on that in a house that like you needed to use like a shield key to get in to fight a zombie shark, and I'm like, that should be more realistic.
It's that video game thing of like the more they try to ground something in reality, the weirder it seems. Like
Yeah.
when they try to explain away Nathan Drake killing 1,000 people, it's all of a sudden calls attention to it. Or I think the Tomb Raider example is really good, where like when she kills the first dude, it's like really sad, and then every other dude after that doesn't matter.
I think a penny in for a pound. Yeah.
Yeah, because they make you store your stuff in a real, actual concrete box. The physics of that box all of a sudden start being really questionable.
Yeah.
Fine.
But yeah, I didn't think about it much while playing
Yeah,
it.
there's also some cool kind of level up things. You collect these coins. This is not on the sheet. It feels embargoed, but it's not on the sheet. I'm allowed to say it. You collect these coins that you then kind of put in these little bird cages that give you.
Free birds?
No, that would be cool. It's basically different level ups, like increases to your stamina or overall health by
So are
these
they-
coins that you collect. And
Yeah, it's weird because it's like I was wondering for the whole first like 2 hours of the game, like where is the shopkeeper? And then you find like this RV that's full of bird
Yes.
cages,
Yep.
and you've been collecting these coins the whole game. It's like
you're like,
strange
what do
coins.
they do?
I
Can
think.
I get
And-
rid of them?
Yeah, and you don't know what they're for. And then like one of them has like a really nice pistol in it that I could not afford, and then the rest have like hypodermic needles with permanent stat upgrades
Yes,
in them.
that's what it is, yeah.
And it's like such a just another weird departure of like I was expecting a dude in a trench coat to
Yeah.
open his thing and like
Yeah.
have all this stuff, but instead of just like no, here's a RV with bird
Just has this
cages
all
with
locked in
guns.
But there's
some
nobody
reason.
working in there?
No, it's just
Just
you.
go in there.
So there's
like
no
a
guy
safe
who's
zone.
like, got some rare things on sale for you,
No,
stranger.
unfortunately not.
That's
It's all in
odd.
your head.
Yeah, but
God, that's so weird. So what's like? I mean, obviously you're trying to save somebody who is like kidnapped or something, right? But like, other than that, why? Like, what is compelling you to stay in this house? Like, can you just go outside and go run in the field and leave?
No.
Like, no,
no.
That
I
sucks.
mean,
I'm not playing
you know,
this
you
game.
can
I'll
try.
leave the house.
You can't get out.
you can't get out.
The one moment where you get the closest to getting out, they stop you. It's so like every time that the game's like, yeah, you're obviously going to try and get out here, a conflict will happen, so you can't leave.
Oh my god.
It's pretty smartly done, but it's also that I don't really want to leave. I'm so interested in the big
Yeah.
family that I'm like, I'm going to find out what's going on with all of you weird people.
And I noticed that like for PSVR, there's a bunch of different comfort options. Like you can sort of turn in the kind of pie chart fashion, which we've talked about on the show before, which is sort of like
Where it
clicks.
jumps
Yeah.
45 degrees.
Yeah. Or you can just go full comfort or uncomfort mode and just run around this house. I don't like. I've got my VR legs. I just don't know if this is something I'm ready to do. Like,
think
I love horror movies. I think I'm going to be a big baby.
I played a bunch of horror VR games, and every time I say this, people like, speak for yourself, but I really think this is going to be way too scary to play in VR. There was one boss fight that I'm not allowed to talk about, but it was basically in a confined space where I was being followed, and I sort of had to run and then attack and run and attack just in this really small square with a pole in the middle, so I couldn't see the person who was following me all the time. And every time that I died after that, I had to put the controller down and take a breather for like 5-10 minutes because it's not that it was hard or that it was scary. It was just very intense. So therefore I was like, okay, I need to breathe and then pick back up.
Dying in first-person horror is what is, I think, what actually gets to me. It's like walking around is one thing, the tension of all that, but when you get killed, it's a different story. Like Max and I play this game called Crystal Rift, which is on PSVR. Not a great game. It's sort of this like cheesy, old school, like PC dungeon crawling adventure game. And I went home and I tried it in VR, and there was this like part where these like just huge saw blades come swinging down, and one of them killed me. And like when you die in that game, it's just this very guttural like, ah!
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
blood, I think.
That's bad sound design.
And yeah, it's just very hokey, but something about it just was just like, oh God, like this
Yeah.
is getting to me.
I don't think it was the death that bothered me. I think that it was the constant tension.
Yeah.
You didn't have any break from that boss fight. You couldn't escape. You were just stuck in this very small room having to either run or attack constantly. No peace at all. I feel like doing that in VR would just be horrible. Like, I think you could play small chunks, but there are some jump scares and just some moments like
there's
that
this,
that are
like-
way too intense.
There's this quote that I think about all that, because I've never played a horror game in VR, and I will probably die having never played a horror game in VR. Like, I just have no interest in ever doing it. I think there was an interview, I think on IGN, with the makers of Until Dawn, talking about the Until
Rush of
Dawn
Blood.
Yeah.
They were talking about Rush of Blood, and there's like a quote from like the dude who is, I guess, the head of, I can't remember the name of that developer right now, but the head of that company saying, we think jump scares are great in VR. And I'm just like, you and me are just could not be more different
Yeah.
people. Like, that is I've never disagreed with any sentence out of any human being's mouth more than
Yeah.
jump scares are great in VR.
And again, that's one of those games that's like kind of cheesy, kind of hokey, but in VR, it's kind of terrifying.
I
Like
mean,
when
it's a totally separate game in VR
Yeah.
as well. But
Oh,
I
yeah,
played
for
that
sure,
at
'cause
Paris
it's on
Games
rails.
Week. Yeah, played it at Paris Games Week, and there's this one moment where you get to the bottom of this hill, and I was like looking around, there was nothing there, and I was like, I know that when I look to the left is going to be the moment where the thing pops out and
Yep.
you get to continue. And they were like, you have to do it. And I was like, I don't want to look to the left. They were like, you cannot proceed without the jump scare. I was like, do you understand why that's ridiculous? Like, I
Yep.
figured out that it's there. I've evaded it, so I just closed my eyes, looked, and
Take
then
off the
kept going. I
headphones,
was
yeah.
like,
it's
I'm
actually
fine.
really funny watching somebody play a VR horror game because if you're looking at the TV, like you just see the ceiling and the floor because they're like, ah! They just look away from what they actually should be looking
Yeah,
at.
and the thing that I think is the biggest difference between regular horror, because I love horror games so much, I think the difference between playing a game normally and playing it in VR is that you don't have a sense of personal space.
Yeah.
And you really do need a break from that because you can't put your hands in front of your eyes. You don't have the setting of a living room to save you from whatever you're seeing.
You have the buffer of reality between you and the TV,
Exactly.
so you can like look left and be like, oh, that's a window
Yeah.
that goes outside where people are happy.
And I'm familiar with this environment, whereas when you're in VR, you have no sense of comfort whatsoever. You're in an environment you don't know. It's just so overwhelming. And I would be amazed if, well, I'm sure someone will, but how many people will actually manage to finish the full game in VR? I'd be really
I
surprised.
read a quote a couple months back from one of the people working on Alien Isolation about how they were kind of like thinking about bringing stuff to VR, even just like in a sort of like compartmentalized version of what the actual game is. And I think like just the simple act of like sitting behind a crate in VR and leaning your head out and waiting for something to kill you, like that's a game. That's already enough to be like,
You know,
okay, like that stimulates a response inside
I
me.
think Alien Isolation would actually work pretty well in VR because a lot of it is you paying attention to the cues, like, you know, when you see
Yep.
the saliva coming from the ceiling and like the music cues, whereas Resident Evil is a lot of you being chased, which is a totally different feeling. Like, I feel like Alien Isolation would work kind of well. You also get enough breaks.
Yeah.
The Android stuff would suck, though.
Yeah,
do
for
we
sure.
know how because I haven't played RE7 in VR yet. Is it still using a controller? Are you still like aiming your gun
Yeah.
with a stick?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is kind of a comfort.
Yeah.
There's
yeah, I
actually
guess so.
there's two demos out. There's the kitchen demo, which is part of that
Right.
that demo disc that came with the system, or it's downloadable on the store. And then they launched that new one right at PSX, which is the entire full demo that's been out for Resident Evil 7, but now is completely in VR. And that's a good way to sort of test.
Have
like,
you tried that?
Yeah,
How was it in VR?
terrifying.
Yeah.
Does it feel weird? Because I feel like when I'm in VR, if I'm looking in the first person, there's a gun in front of me. My gut, just because having played like so much Oculus and Vive stuff, is I want to be the one aiming that gun.
Right.
And like at a certain point, like the Wii version of Resident Evil 4 had more realistic gun aiming than it sounds like RE7 VR does.
Yeah,
Does
and
that
was
feel
like-
weird?
That was my favorite version for a while of that game, which is probably my favorite Resident Evil game and one of my top 5 favorite games of all time. I just adore that game. Quick shout out to the people making like there's a fan site making like a ultra HD version of that you should check.
Oh,
That's
for real?
really cool. But in Resident Evil, I found that the tension mostly came from moving around and waiting and hearing, and like it's the scariest parts were not when I was doing something; it was when I wasn't.
No,
Yeah.
it's like the spider rule. If you can't
Yeah.
see the spider, it's more scary because it could come out at any moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
And
Second
I
you're
mean,
looking
like
at it.
with all first-person stuff in VR and PSVR specifically, like one of the hardest things about it is obviously walking and aiming and shooting at the same time. You just run out of inputs. So if you have 2 move controllers or whatever it is, it's just doesn't really get you there. So you end up having to do that like teleport thing, and then so I don't think they're gonna add support for anything like that. I would love that in some way because I'm totally with you. Like walking around is one thing, but the second you have to aim and you're using sticks, like there's a disconnect there.
Yeah.
So I don't know. We'll see.
Also, that game is kind of gorgeous. Like I haven't heard a lot of people talk about it, but it totally has that like weird PT vibe of like this looks like somebody scanned in like some 3D telemetry like photos or something of an actual environment. Like you can look at every book on a bookshelf. I saw a book on a bookshelf that just was called Street Fighting
I love that
Pretty
book.
good.
Yeah, it's a great book.
Yeah, it's like a weird.
It is quite pretty.
It's a weird game to be gorgeous because it's hideous.
Right.
Like, and I mean that in the best way possible.
It's
Like,
so hideous.
like when you lift up the lid of a pot and it's like, oh, I wonder what's inside. Is it mealworms? Yes, it is. It's
But
always
the main
mealworms.
game is so much more colorful than the
Yeah.
demo as well. Like there's just, I feel like it's
Really?
way more colorful. I feel like that demo is kind of just like a lot of gray and black, whereas the house doesn't actually feel scary. Like I don't think that this is a pure horror game in the kind of way that PT is. It's an action survival horror. It's, it doesn't, you don't feel scared all the time. It's only really when there's a threat present. And, you know, there's a lot of creative stuff in the environment.
Well, this feels more like tangible horror, and PT was more sort of psychological horror,
Yeah,
where you would
that's
loop through and all of a
absolutely
sudden
true.
you'd be like, oh, a poltergeist.
You just
What I
never
lo-
feel comfortable, but
Yeah.
you do sometimes in Resident Evil 7.
Yeah.
What I loved about PT is that it was in like a very familiar setting. Like that house was like a house that your friend lived in. Like
Yeah.
it was a house that you could picture yourself in. What I've seen in Resident Evil is like it's this Texas Chainsaw Massacre house, which is more like, ooh, it's the
It is.
countryside.
Yeah, you're right.
It's
It's,
a
a huge house.
Just a big nasty house that a bunch of weird people have lived in for a really long time.
that.
Well, like
I-
the scariest part in that movie is when Leatherface chases that woman into that one room that like you never really see again. It's just a room,
all
and
the
it's just full of
Maze.
bones.
Oh.
Yeah, like she chases him into this room, or he chases her into this room, and she just falls on the floor, and she's
Yeah.
like, "What the?" And there's just bones everywhere, and like dead chickens hanging upside down. And then they leave, and you're like,
never
"Wait,
look
what?"
again.
And like Resident Evil 7 feels like they just built an entire house out of that room. Like
Yeah,
it's just gross.
I'm kind of tired of that, you know. Like I'm really sick of like horror stuff that revisits the same tropes, like whether it's a Victorian mental hospital or a graveyard or a forest, or there's always these same kind of horror levels that you see all the time.
Yeah.
And like I think PT really hit the nail on the head with like, oh, this is familiar. Like this is something that this is like a house. This is like
I thought PT going away was gonna stop hurting so much eventually, and it doesn't. Every
Yeah,
day I'm
every
still
day.
sad about it.
It's still like, yeah, it's because it's just, it was like such a promising thing. It was sort of like, it was like they told you they were going to make a movie out of one of those like trailers that they had during Grindhouse.
Right.
And then they made 3 of them.
My thing is, Silent Hill PT might actually be my favorite game. Like I love it so much, and I've replayed it so many times. Like I just adore it, and I feel like there's no way that Silent Hills could live up to that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Like I
that's a
figure
big question
if
mark.
it's the last Silent Hill thing that exists, like while I would have loved what Kojima had planned for Hills, like it's great. It's still
Yeah.
very good.
You know what you don't hear people talk about that much is the final line of PT. When you beat it and they play the trailer and Norman Reedus shows up and everything, there's a line at the end that says like, "This is a teaser, not intended to be representative of final gameplay."
Yeah.
And that to me is actually like that makes me feel slightly less bad about Silent Hills not coming out because I would have wanted it to just be that. Like I
Right.
would have
Right.
wanted
Totally.
more of that
That's
weird
how I feel
mind
about
game
it.
stuff.
I think maybe that's just what I'm saying to make myself feel better about it. But
Right.
it's
we're
work,
we're
so
both
it's fine.
coping. It's,
I like in a perfect world, I would have taken a thing like that every year and a half. That was just like here's
like that.
here's a living room with a table in the middle, and every time you walk around the table, more ghosts and dead baby aliens
just a
appear.
20-minute unbeatable demo
Yeah.
every
Yeah.
18
Yeah.
months.
Yeah.
Full of like secrets and puzzles, and the whole internet's coming together to find. And which is like there's an element of that in Resident Evil
Oh,
7.
it's absolutely going to be like that. The Reddit is just full of theories of people overthinking stuff.
Yep.
But also, when I was at Capcom, they told me that no one has found the fastest way to beat the demo yet.
Really?
So, despite this Reddit full of people working
you just
together,
leave the house.
you
Walk
can't.
out the
Front
front
door?
door.
Get out the house.
no, apparently there's something that no one has found. They wouldn't tell
run
me
out
anything
the
else,
front
but
door, yeah.
no one's figured it out
gotta
yet.
jump
so
out the door.
That's
Wow.
awesome.
I can't wait for this game.
Yeah.
Just a few weeks away.